Tragic news to report out of Syria regarding the death of American photojournalist James Foley. Foley was kidnapped in northern Syria in November of 2012, his whereabouts unknown for nearly 2 years. But yesterday, a video was released purportedly showing Foley being beheaded by a member of ISIS. Now, we will not be showing any of that video on the show and recommend you do not share the video online out of respect to Foley's family. But if this brutal murder isn't horrific enough, the video ends by showing another American journalist, Steven Sotloff, on his knees as the man behind him threatens his life as well. Sotloff has been missing since August of last year. After the video's release, Foley's mother, Diane, confirmed his death and released a statement on Facebook in which she writes, "We've never been prouder of our son, Jim. He gave his life trying to expose the world to the suffering of the Syrian people. We implore the kidnappers to spare the lives of the remaining hostages. Like Jim, they're innocent. They have no control over American government policy in Iraq, Syria, or anywhere in the world. We thank Jim for all the joy he gave us. He was an extraordinary son, brother, journalist, and person." Tragically, far too many journalists are paying the ultimate price to expose the daily horrors happening across Syria and Iraq. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 39 reporters are currently missing worldwide, with a stunning 20 of them in Syria alone. At least 69 journalists have been killed in the country since the start of the civil war, and another 165 have lost their lives in Iraq since 1992. Journalists are our only link to what's happening in the most dangerous parts of the world, and without them, atrocities remain secret and mass slaughter stays hidden from the public. So rest in peace, James Foley, and know that your work will live on for years to come.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire was told. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set.
It's been about 6 weeks since Israel launched Operation Protective Edge against the Gaza Strip. And despite repeated attempts at a ceasefire, including one that just collapsed yesterday after rockets were fired from Gaza, the horrors on the ground are ongoing. During the last 24 hours, the IDF has killed another 22 Palestinians. This puts the death toll at 2,035 people and at least 10,300 injured, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. At least a quarter of the dead are children. On the Israeli side, 64 soldiers have died and 3 civilians. Among the latest attacks, Israel bombed the home of a Hamas military chief, but instead of killing him, his wife and infant child were blown apart. Now, this isn't the first time that Israel has alleged to target members of Hamas, but ended up just killing their entire families and not the actual target. Last month, 18 members of a single family were killed in one airstrike, while the target of the strike, a Hamas police chief, was left wounded. Aside from bombs, though, the Israeli military has fired nearly enough bullets to kill every Palestinian in Gaza twice over since the beginning of the operation, according to the Electronic Intifada. But it's not just women and children which have been the collateral damage from Israel's bombing campaign. Schools, mosques, hospitals, and agricultural plots have also been targeted, causing mass animal die-offs, and leaving Gaza's farmers debilitated. Moreover, Gaza's only zoo, a space of 60 acres, has been devastated by shelling, and half of the animals have died from shrapnel, with others from lack of water. So while all eyes are on Ferguson, let's not forget about the continuing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, and hope that all parties can come to the table and come to a lasting agreement that will finally end the siege and stop the bloodshed. Yesterday marked the 10th straight night of protests in Ferguson, Missouri, over the police shooting of unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown. The night was largely peaceful, with the exception of a few bottles being thrown at law enforcement. And although cops did end up arresting more than 40 people by the end of the night, there were no reports of tear gas or smoke bombs being used. And today, a grand jury began to hear evidence concerning the killing of Michael Brown and will decide whether or not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the coming days and months. Meanwhile, controversy abounds over the lead prosecutor investigating the shooting, Robert McCullough, because several of his close family members worked for the St. Louis Police Department. Furthermore, his police officer father was killed in the line of duty when he was a child, raising serious questions about his objectivity when it comes to Brown's case. However, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon has refused to remove McCullough, calling for a vigorous prosecution. So to discuss these developments, I'm joined now by Mike Papantonio, attorney, co-host of the Ring of Fire radio show. Always amazing to have you on, Mike.
Abby, how are you?
I'm doing well. Mike, I have to tell you, now this is odd. I was watching a live stream of Ferguson last night, and it appeared that journalists actually far outnumbered protesters. I mean, do you think the enormous amount of reporters on the ground is actually exacerbating the situation purely for the purpose of keeping the story alive?
Well, we've seen that is the way of the world with journalism nowadays, and that certainly seems to be the case here. But I think there's some good reporting coming out of here. I think, first of all, had you not had this type of reporting, the U.S. Justice Department wouldn't have made the move that they've made. Here you have Holder seeing the same things we've all observed from different angles of the camera. They're all interested in the same stories. As you point out, there's so many moving parts. Bob McCullough, the prosecutor, has been asked to investigate this homicide this man has such incredibly strong ties. His uncle, his mother, his brother, his cousin, his father worked for the Ferguson Police Department. Add to that the fact, as you point out, Jay Nixon incredibly seems to be good with that, will not replace McCullough. Here's the problem when that happens. Here's the stories that those reporters that you're talking about need to be reporting about. You need to have a prosecutor unconnected with this Ferguson community. You need to have a grand jury unconnected with what's going on there. This prosecutor is going to have the ability, if you really think about what the downside is, and I hope the media will cover this, the prosecutor is going to have the ability to heavily load and manipulate his presentation of evidence to this grand jury without that grand jury ever understanding what's happening. It's the prosecutor in a room with the grand jury, nobody giving all the sides of this. If this prosecutor feels like Officer Wilson is on his way to a second-degree murder charge, well, what does he do? He tweaks that presentation with a witness or very selective forensic evidence that reduces that possibility. Worse yet, let's imagine the grand jury does indict. All along the way, the presentation of the trial, anyone with the slightest bit of cynicism is wondering whether McCullough is really nothing more than a Trojan horse passively or actively working to undermine the case. And those would be real world concerns, Abby.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm glad you just brought up all of that. I wanted to talk about this jury as far as Wilson's possible arrest. It might take up to 2 months until a grand jury decides whether there's enough evidence to indict him. I wanted you to talk about why this process is so complicated, seemingly. And if it does go to court, how much damage do you think the media repeatedly playing the robbery footage of Michael Brown will impact the jury?
Well, it always impacts the jury. Unfortunately, I have a different take on this case, Abby. It's a little different from what most people are talking about right now, because I have been a prosecutor, I've been a criminal defense lawyer, but the main thing is I've always been a trial lawyer. The truth is that even the early stages in this case, an experienced criminal defense lawyer would tell you even right now that they look at this case and it's very winnable. Mark O'Mara, for example, a good friend of mine, handled the Zimmerman defense. Was put in that situation, and he and I were talking about this case today. And here's the problems. These are the things that the journalists need to be very careful of when they report these issues. Proximity is something you're going to see the defense use. The closer you put Officer Wilson to a 6'4", 300-pound Michael Brown, who appears to be moving forward with his arms extended, the better chance the defense has to sell reasonable use of force, reasonable mistake, and panic. Now, to tie that into the journalism aspect of it, they have to understand that part of the story. They have to understand that this prosecutor needs to be, as he's presenting this information to the grand jury, these are all things that the grand jury is going to be thinking about. Or how about this, where you have the suggestion that Brown was in a hyper-agitated state of mind in the way that he dealt with the shopkeeper by shoving the shopkeeper around, that didn't just arise. That came out of, as you point out, that came out of the narrative that's out there with the journalists. This agitated state of mind argument for Brown completely helps the defense. Add to that the possibility of them finding blood spray patterns in the officer's patrol car that are consistent with Brown's DNA. Go a step further and put Brown's DNA on the officer's firearm. All of a sudden you have a very different case. That's why your point about how this is reported, what is the narrative that's created, all of these things can be tweaked just a little bit, and all of a sudden you have a jury that says, gee whiz, this poor officer just panicked, this poor officer was put in a situation where he didn't know what to do, so he started firing his gun. That is not manslaughter, that is not second-degree murder under the rules of law. So the way the journalists handle this, as you point out, are extremely important, because these are very fine line issues that all can be changed, very quickly.
Right. Thank you so much for breaking that down. Really, really fascinating there. And you're right, it is really important. One thing that I find particularly fascinating, Mike, is the way that the police are acting despite there being hundreds of cameras on them. I mean, countless journalists have been arrested over the course of these demonstrations. Pretty unprecedented. I mean, I was covering the Occupy Oakland protests, and they didn't treat media with this kind of contempt. I'd hate to see how they act when the cameras aren't on them, but I wanted to read you a quote from a Washington Post article entitled, "I'm a cop. If you don't want to get hurt, don't challenge me," written by LAPD officer Sunil Duda. He writes, "If you don't want to get shot, tased, pepper sprayed, struck with a baton, or thrown to the ground, do what I tell you. Don't argue with me. Don't call me names. Don't tell me that I can't stop. Don't say I'm a racist pig. Don't threaten me that you'll sue me and take away my badge." Mike, as a lawyer, does a cop have the right to use force for any of those actions?
Well, this is the era of the ninja cop, so it's a moving target. Listen, you have these ninja cops, these particularly bad in the South. They're Dixieland stormtroopers. It would be a Barney Fife kind of situation that's almost laughable if it weren't so serious. But you've taken these undertrained police officers, you've given them shock wave cannons, you've given them LRADs, LRAD sound shock cannons, you've given them taser drones, for God's sakes. The government has armed them to the T. And you know what? When you put that kind of material in somebody who's not prepared to handle it, they're not trained to handle it, all of a sudden the same thing happens that we see happen in Ferguson all over the country. Look, if you take a look at the MMPI of these characters, why is it that they all have shaved heads? They have the Bruce Willis goatee. They have guns strapped over every appendage of their body, because they become what they think about. And what we have done is we have empowered all that by giving them tanks, by giving them helicopters, by giving them AK-47s. The federal government is just as responsible in this because of their 1033 program that we pump billions of dollars in to arm these Dixieland stormtroopers heavily along the southern coast of this United States. I mean,
I wanted to jump in here really quick because we have about a minute left, but in your mind, Mike, what measures need to be taken to address this community's grievances?
Well, we need to return to the idea of the policemen having a connection to the community where they're not occupiers, but they have a connection. They care about the community. The community cares about them. They don't dress up like ninja cops. They dress up more like Andy of Mayberry. They can still carry a gun, they can still be effective, they can still protect themselves, but it's the whole mentality that has got to be changed. It's all post 9/11. Bush put a huge amount of dollars into these programs to arm them to the teeth, and now we're seeing the result of it, and it's very, very ugly, unfortunately. It's not just Ferguson, by the way. It's happening all over the South right now.
It is indeed, and I couldn't agree more with that assessment. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on. Mike Papantonio, co-host of Ring of Fire Radio.
Thank you, Abby.
Coming up, I'll talk about a rare victory when it comes to recording the cops. Stay tuned. The government says it wants to close Gitmo.
The Secretary of Defense and Defense Department are committed to the president's goal of closing Guantanamo Bay.
But why are there so many legal roadblocks for the remaining detainees?
The United States Constitution doesn't apply to these proceedings.
The government has demonstrated that they have no respect for the attorney-client relationship.
No, you can't look inside that door. No, you can't see the place which is adjacent to the client's cell. If the public knew what actually happened, that heads would roll.
There are a lot of issues that are being handled at a higher level.
Join us as we seek answers to those issues and much more. This is Abby Martin breaking the set from Guantanamo Bay. Since the shooting of Michael Brown, it's been utter mayhem in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri, with thousands of overly militarized riot police who look like they belong in Afghanistan more than the U.S., responding to mostly peaceful protests using such methods as tear gas, rubber bullets, smoke, and flashbang grenades at civilians with little to no provocation. There's also been looting and reports of live ammo being fired from the crowd throughout the last week and a half. Because of this, hundreds of journalists, along with international observers, have fled to the scene to film police activity. But being on film hasn't stopped the police from treating the media with utter contempt, already detaining at least 11 journalists. So if the police are acting this way when hundreds of cameras are on them, imagine how they would act if they weren't being filmed. And in fact, it begs the question, if Michael Brown would have been shot if a camera had been rolling on police officer Darren Wilson. Then we wouldn't have to be asking if Brown had his hands up saying don't shoot like witnesses allege, or reach for the officer's gun like the police claim. See, if Ferguson PD mandated its officers to use body cameras, dashboard cameras, or both, we'd most likely know the answer. Amazingly, the department has these cameras but enforces no policy ensuring that officers use them, according to the Washington Post. And get this. Even with departments that mandate dash and lapel cams on officers, it's not required that footage is even released to the public. Now, just yesterday, Ferguson officials did pledge to start using these cameras in the wake of the Michael Brown shooting, which is a definite step in the right direction. But even though putting cameras on police is good in theory, it's paramount that you become a proactive citizen and start filming the police. Start policing the police. You see, despite efforts to criminalize filming cops, it's still perfectly legal in all 50 states to document police activity while they're on the job, whether it be filming, recording, or photographing. In fact, just today, a New York man won an important victory against the NYPD for this very reason. The man, Dick George, says that in 2012, he photographed a cop conducting a stop and frisk search on 3 young African Americans. After the incident, when officers overheard George advising the youths to record police badge numbers next time, the cops pulled George from his car, dragged him back to the station, and charged him with disorderly conduct. Throughout his hour-long custody, George alleges he was strip-searched and that the photos from his cell phone were deleted. But George is having the last laugh, as he was awarded $125,000 in a settlement with the NYPD, who saw it as an easier way to resolve the case before it went to trial. As a result of the fiasco, the NYPD sent out a memo iterating to officials that the public has the right to record them while on duty, and that any and all attempts to thwart their recording is a violation of the First Amendment. So here's a public service announcement. Don't forget that the power lies with you to hold law enforcement accountable for its abuse. And that starts with being ready to film. If you see something, film something. When it comes to the NSA's dragnet spying capabilities, nothing seems surprising anymore. From bulk data collection onto spying on foreign leaders, the agency has proven that when it comes to surveillance, there's no such thing as borders or boundaries. Especially the insidious revelation that the NSA is conducting complete and total audio surveillance of entire countries. Earlier this summer, The Intercept exposed that the U.S. government has been recording every single phone call in the small island nation of the Bahamas. This program includes storing the total audio communications of about 370,000 people without their knowledge or the consent of the Bahamian government. According to leaked documents by Edward Snowden, this program was codenamed Somal Get, and according to WikiLeaks, was also being employed in one other country, Afghanistan, although it's never been clear what the two countries could possibly have in common when it comes to national security, especially considering the fact that the State Department has even described the Bahamas as a country where, quote, there is little to no threat facing Americans from domestic terrorism, war, or civil unrest. Thanks to the leaked documents, however, we also know that Somal-Get is part of a larger surveillance program called Mystic, which has been used to monitor the communications of at least 3 other world nations, Mexico, Kenya, and the Philippines. According to The Intercept, one of the leaked documents describes the Bahamas as a testing ground for Somal-Get's capabilities, given the country's relatively small population and close regional proximity to the U.S. While outrageous in scope, this story didn't garner the international attention you might expect, which is why I invited Nimrod Kamer on the show, one of the few journalists to actually go to the Bahamas to get some answers. Now, Nimrod joined me earlier, and considering that the Bahamas revolution came out of left field, I first asked him what he found to be the NSA's primary motivations behind the total surveillance of its citizens.
My opinion is they're using the Bahamas as a test case to see if they can record all the phone calls. Just my opinion, talking to politicians and being there, because it's like a really easy target. Because people in the Bahamas are not likely to say no to the US. Like the Bahamian government were like susceptible to being like requested. They don't even admit that they got any specific requests, and they don't say whether they knew about it or not. But like all the people we met, especially the people who protested for freedom of information, it's in part 1 of my film, it looks like they are sure it's all about economic surveillance, drugs. I took my drone with me so I can like convey the feeling of surveillance, like flying it above, just to make, because you can't really get to the NSA in the Bahamas, they have no office, so to portray the enemy, I was like flying the drone above and like making people put NSA stickers on their phones to remind them that every time they click send, someone is listening.
Right.
And
no,
I think it's just a test
yeah.
case, like, so they can see if they can target the whole country. Yeah.
Right. I was going to ask you why you chose to use a surveillance tool to portray surveillance, but I mean, it's ridiculously good-looking shots that you were getting of that drone there.
Yeah. I think you cannot do journalism today without drones. Like, suppose you want to spy or like get information from a corrupt CEO of a bank, so you fly the drone at his window and you can look at documents if it's in the public interest. Or if there's like a really corrupt like politician, you can fly the drone above his house, not necessarily above the fence, but above you standing outside the fence. And we could have flown it like theoretically in the Bahamian US government, like embassy, but there was no specific reason. So we just used the drone in the Bahamas to get some shots of the parliament, to get shots of the protests from above. And people actually asked me, can you put guns on your drone? And I said, no, it's a small drone. It's like the opposite of like a military drone. It's a drone for journalism. And yeah, it really fit the narrative of like being surveyed. And potentially if you can get the entire, it's really weird that the Bahamas are in this story. It was a good chance for me to go there. I've never been. We spoke to Bahamian journalists, radio hosts. My guy Tom Bell, who shot the whole thing and flew the drone, got like good angles of like, we went to the slums. Everybody knew about Edward Snowden in the slums of Nassau, the main island. And it looks like if you can record the entire island, you can do it to other islands, potentially like Cuba, just as a test case to see if the local phone company would resist.
Yeah, well, that's what I love about your report, Nimrod, because, you know, I rally against drones all the time, but I mean, drones are a reality, and it's time that journalists kind of adopt drone technology to tell a story that can't be told necessarily from the ground. What was your response, or what was the response, rather, by average people in the Bahamas to know that they're being spied on, and what types of measures are they taking to get around the surveillance?
So they got nothing to do, because even if they complain to the government says we have no idea, but they don't deny it as well. And the local people in the street would just either be pissed or say they got nothing to hide. The Bahamian newspaper is covering it, but there's no one to go to. Like, no one would like comment. If you go to the US Embassy, there's nothing, no one to speak to. There's no villain in the story. That's why I kind of used the drone to portray a villain, because there's no one to protest against, really. Just the Bahamian government, but they're like numb. They would like... And I caught one of the ministers in the Bahamas saying that the US would do whatever they want, and we showed that, like filming him from a distance with a radio mic on me. It's a great way for me. I love this way to do journalism. Do like a long angle, like zoom in on something, and me standing talking to a politician. If it's in the public square, it's like okay, like it's fair game, and like getting something that you would not say in a proper interview with a radio mic on me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that some people you were talking to were talking about how they just are going to use emojis now. I mean, is that if that's going to be the future of communication, where we're just going to be describing things? How would you describe your feelings with NSA surveillance and just emojis?
Looks like the NSA cannot read emojis, because obviously an NSA person can look at emojis and get them, like the drug emoji, the pill emoji, but the computers, the mass surveillance computers, they can't really handle emojis. And I'm saying it as an assumption after speaking to a few analysts, because if you forward an emoji, you get like squares, like if you have a BlackBerry. You can't handle emojis as a machine. You get just squares. So I told people in the Bahamas they should use emojis to convey themselves. In the future, there's going to be more choice in the emoji keyboard to like do more like planning or whatever. And even black people, most of Bahamian people are black, and there's no black people in the emoji keyboard.
I want to see a ton more emojis, Nimrod. I'm a big fan of them, and I think that you're onto something there. If this is about financial or economic espionage, I mean, you just said the Bahamian government's really not doing much, but why do you think that they're not really doing anything to put an end to this?
They just released statements, and like Obama told them they're not doing it any longer. Privately, looks like it, so they're just fine with it, and they won't like really open any investigation, even though they should. It's a great way for the Bahamian people to get on the world stage. If they do open a proper investigation and subpoena people somehow from the US, like the Prime Minister of the Bahamas went to the US and he got like secret reassurances, whatever, but he never published exactly what he got. I think the Bahamian people should use this chance to like protest more loudly and go all over the place. And I mean, no one can tell them for sure it's not going to happen again. Right. And they should get all the records. I mean, the NSA says they might delete some stuff after 1 month. Many Bahamian people I met said they want to get the recordings that, I mean, just listen to themselves.
Nimrod, thanks for staying on this story. You're always involved in amazing media projects. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insight. Nimrod Kamer, journalist, correspondent, thanks so much. Thanks for watching, you guys. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at Abby Martin. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again. In Syria alone, at least 69 journalists have been killed in the country since the start of the civil war, and another 165 have lost their lives in Iraq since 1992. Journalists are our only link to what's happening in the most dangerous parts of the world, and without them, atrocities remain secret and mass slaughter stays hidden from the public. So rest in peace, James Foley, and know that your work will live on for years to come.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire and tone. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
It's been about 6 weeks since Israel launched Operation Protective Edge against the Gaza Strip. And despite repeated attempts at a ceasefire, including one that just collapsed yesterday after rockets were fired from Gaza, the horrors on the ground are ongoing. After the video's release, Foley's mother, Diane, confirmed his death and released a statement on Facebook in which she writes, We've never been prouder of our son, Jim. He gave his life trying to expose the world to the suffering of the Syrian people. We implore the kidnappers to spare the lives of the remaining hostages. Like Jim, they're innocent. They have no control over American government policy in Iraq, Syria, or anywhere in the world. We thank Jim for all the joy he gave us. He was an extraordinary son, brother, journalist, and person. Tragically, far too many journalists are paying the ultimate price to expose the daily horrors happening across Syria and Iraq. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 39 reporters are currently missing worldwide, with a stunning 20 of them. Tragic news to report out of Syria regarding the death of American photojournalist James Foley. Foley was kidnapped in northern Syria in November of 2012, his whereabouts unknown for nearly 2 years. But yesterday, a video was released purportedly showing Foley being beheaded by a member of ISIS. Now, we'll not be showing any of that video on the show and recommend you do not share the video online out of respect to Foley's family. But if this brutal murder isn't horrific enough, the video ends by showing another American journalist, Stephen Sotloff, on his knees as the man behind him threatens his life as well. Sotloff has been missing since August of last year. During the last 24 hours, the IDF has killed another 22 Palestinians. This puts the death toll at 2,035 people and at least 10,300 injured, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health. At least a quarter of the dead are children. On the Israeli side, 64 soldiers have died and 3 civilians. Among the latest attacks, Israel bombed the home of a Hamas military chief, but instead of killing him, his wife and infant child were blown apart. Now, this isn't the first time that Israel has alleged to target members of Hamas, but ended up just killing their entire families and not the actual target. Last month, 18 members of a single family were killed in one airstrike.